In 1975, was 44 years old, operating as a contract killer and intelligence broker, moving between the streets of Detroit and the quiet suburb of. Detroit at the time was known for its powerful criminal networks, expanding heroin trade, and deep institutional corruption. It was a place where violence was controlled rather than chaotic, where organized crime groups maintained order through intimidation and influence. Entire neighborhoods operated under invisible authority, and information was as valuable as money. The city carried a quiet tension. Deals were made in private clubs, and decisions made in silence often led to sudden consequences. Witnesses disappeared. Cases collapsed. Names were spoken carefully, if at all. Law enforcement existed, but it was not always trusted, and in some cases, it was compromised from within. At the time, Campbell was one of the most feared individuals in Detroit's underworld. He was known not only for violence, but for knowledge. The environment rewarded those who could control others through fear and intelligence, while punishing those who exposed themselves or lost control. In this system, survival depended on discipline, secrecy, and the ability to act without hesitation. Campbell operated within this structure with unusual precision. He was connected to powerful figures within who relied on him to enforce their influence in areas they could not directly control. At the same time, multiple law enforcement agencies were attempting to track his activities, though often without success. By early 1975, he had built a reputation that extended beyond Detroit. His name was known among criminals, investigators, and prosecutors alike. He was associated with multiple homicides, though rarely charged and almost never convicted. Witnesses connected to his cases frequently died before they could testify. The balance between criminal power and legal authority in Detroit was already unstable. Campbell existed at the center of that imbalance, operating between both worlds, understood by both, but controlled by neither. By the early 1970s, Chester Wheeler Campbell had established himself as a high-level freelance assassin and intelligence operator, working independently but closely aligned with organized crime interests. A former inmate who had spent 13 years in prison following a 1955 murder conviction, he entered prison as a young offender and left as a highly disciplined and calculated individual. During his incarceration at Michigan State Prison, he studied criminal law, investigative methods, surveillance techniques, and foreign languages. He also learned from other inmates involved in organized crime, gaining knowledge of drug distribution systems and enforcement strategies. These years shaped his approach. Unlike many criminals, Campbell did not rely on impulse. He relied on preparation. He observed patterns, collected information, and acted only when necessary. After his release in 1969, he did not attempt to build a traditional criminal organization. Instead, he positioned himself as a specialist. He offered his services as a contract killer for a high fee, reportedly around $15,000 per job. This was an unusually high amount at the time, but it reflected his reputation for efficiency and reliability. He carried himself with calm control and emotional distance. He spoke clearly, without urgency, and avoided unnecessary attention. He often dressed entirely in black, creating a consistent and recognizable presence. This appearance, combined with his behavior, contributed to a reputation that was both visible and intimidating. In public settings, he presented a different image. He attended plays, visited museums, and engaged in intellectual pursuits. He was described as articulate and composed, capable of blending into environments where he would not be suspected. This contrast made him more difficult to identify and predict. Among drug dealers, mob affiliates, and criminal enforcers, Campbell represented precision and inevitability. He was seen as someone who would act without hesitation once a decision had been made. His presence alone was often enough to enforce compliance. Within a system dominated by Campbell held a unique position. He was not a traditional member of the organization, but he was trusted and supported by key figures within it. The group provided him with resources, protection, and access to drug supply networks, while he provided enforcement in areas where they faced resistance. He also developed a personal intelligence system that set him apart. He maintained detailed notebooks containing names, addresses, habits, and connections of individuals across Detroit, including criminals, law enforcement officers, judges, and witnesses. He gathered this information through surveillance, conversations, and paid contacts, including individuals within law enforcement who could access official databases. This system allowed him to track targets, anticipate movements, and avoid detection. It also gave him leverage. Knowledge of personal details and routines made it possible to control situations without direct confrontation. Among those who worked with or against him, Campbell came to represent more than a single individual. He represented a method, a way of operating that combined patience, intelligence, and controlled violence. In a system shaped by power struggles and uncertainty, he became a constant presence, predictable in his discipline but unpredictable in his actions. By the time of his arrest in 1975, Chester Wheeler Campbell was no longer viewed as just a criminal. He was regarded as a central figure in Detroit's underworld, a man whose influence extended through both fear and information, and whose presence affected decisions on both sides of the law. But not everyone respected. One force in particular, multiple law enforcement agencies and internal criminal rivals, embodied growing danger. These forces included Detroit police, federal investigators, and competing figures within the underworld who saw Campbell not as an asset, but as a threat to their own control. They were persistent, organized, and increasingly aware of what Campbell represented. Investigators had followed his name through multiple homicide cases. Rival criminals had seen what happened to those who crossed him. Both groups understood that his influence was expanding beyond normal limits. Law enforcement knew he had connections inside the system. Officers suspected that some individuals were running license plates and sharing information with him through official networks. This made their work difficult and unpredictable. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses refused to speak or were killed before they could testify. At the same time, rivals within the criminal world viewed Campbell as dangerous not only because of his violence, but because of his knowledge. He kept records. He tracked people. He knew where individuals lived, how they moved, and who they trusted. This made him different from others. He was not reacting to events. He was preparing for them. These opposing forces believed one thing in common. Campbell had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. He had been linked to many murders but convicted of only one. Every attempt to build a case against him had failed. Witnesses died. Evidence was weakened. Cases collapsed before reaching court. To those watching him, it appeared that he could act, plan, and move freely without being stopped. Continued his activities by exploiting weaknesses in both law enforcement and the criminal justice system. One major weakness was witness protection. Individuals who agreed to testify against him were not safe. Even in secure locations, they were found and killed. This created fear among potential witnesses. Many refused to cooperate, knowing the risk. Another weakness was internal corruption. Some law enforcement personnel provided access to sensitive information, including vehicle records and personal data. This allowed Campbell to stay ahead of investigations and avoid detection. Authority tolerated these failures in part because of the complexity of the situation. Multiple agencies were involved, and coordination between them was limited. In some cases, agencies competed for control over information rather than sharing it. This reduced effectiveness and slowed progress. There was also a lack of direct evidence. Campbell rarely left clear traces connecting him to crimes. His methods were controlled and deliberate. Without witnesses or physical proof, prosecutors struggled to build strong cases. Over time, this pattern continued. Arrests did not lead to lasting convictions for violent crimes. Investigations did not produce results. Attempts to stop him were delayed or weakened by internal issues. As a result, Campbell came to believe himself untouchable. He continued to operate with confidence, maintaining his networks, gathering information, and carrying out actions without visible concern for consequences. The first incident occurred during a routine investigation period in the early 1970s. At the time, was already known to police as a suspect in multiple violent crimes. Detectives had his name in their files, his photograph on precinct walls, and his movements loosely tracked through informants and scattered reports. Without overt escalation, law enforcement began to test him. They brought in witnesses quietly. They questioned people in his circle. They placed pressure on individuals connected to him, hoping someone would speak. In one case, a former associate agreed to cooperate and provide testimony linking Campbell to a murder. The system moved forward with caution. The witness was placed in protective custody, held in what authorities believed to be a secure location, a federal prison unit designed to keep informants safe. This was not a public confrontation. There were no direct threats made toward Campbell. Instead, it was a silent challenge. The system was attempting to reach into his world and pull something out of it. Campbell noticed. He understood what was happening without needing it explained. The movement of investigators, the sudden silence from certain contacts, the presence of a witness willing to testify, these were signals he recognized immediately. But he chose not to respond publicly. He did not confront anyone. He did not react in a visible way. He continued his routine, maintaining the same calm behavior that had defined him for years. To outside observers, especially within law enforcement, this appeared as weakness. It suggested that pressure was working, that the system was finally gaining ground, that Campbell, for all his reputation, could be contained through legal means. Some believed he was losing control. Those close to expected a different reaction. Among criminal associates and those familiar with his methods, there was an assumption that he would act quickly, that he would remove the threat before it reached the courtroom, that he would not allow a witness to stand against him. When no immediate action was seen, questions began to form. Some interpreted his silence as hesitation. Others wondered if his influence had weakened. A few believed that the system had finally reached a point where even he could not respond. But restraint was deliberate. Campbell did not act in visible or predictable ways. He waited. He observed how the situation developed. He allowed the system to proceed, to expose its own structure and weaknesses. Those who understood the environment recognized this as strategy. In Detroit's underworld, patience was not passive. It was a method of control. Acting too soon could expose intention. Acting too late could lose advantage. Timing mattered more than speed. Campbell's lack of immediate response did not mean inaction. It meant preparation. And for those who truly understood how he operated, that silence was not reassuring. It was a warning. The next incident occurred months later, inside a courtroom process. This time, the provocation was worse. Prosecutors believed they finally had a case strong enough to hold accountable. A key witness had agreed to testify. This witness was not a stranger. He was someone who knew Campbell's operations, someone who could connect him directly to violent crimes that had remained unsolved. The system moved carefully but confidently. The witness was placed in federal protection. Investigators believed they had secured him beyond reach. Again, Campbell remained restrained. He did not react publicly. He did not attempt to interfere in any visible way. He continued his routine, moving through the city, observing, gathering information, and maintaining control over his environment. Each step forward increased law enforcement confidence. They believed they were closing in. They believed the silence meant they had the advantage. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred shortly after, inside that same federal protection system. This time, the provocation crossed into direct defiance. The protected witness was found dead. His throat had been cut, and marks had been placed on his eyelids. It was not only an act of violence. It was a message. The safest place the government could provide had failed. Again, Campbell remained restrained. There was no statement, no visible reaction, no attempt to explain or deny. His silence continued, unchanged. But the effect was immediate. Fear spread through potential witnesses. Cases that depended on testimony began to weaken. Individuals who had considered cooperating stepped back. Each incident increased his reputation and reduced the willingness of others to stand against him. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred during continued investigations across multiple agencies. This time, The provocation came through pressure from coordination. Detroit police, federal agents, and county authorities began building cases at the same time. They tracked movements, reviewed past files, and attempted to connect separate events into a single pattern. They believed that working together would close the gaps that had allowed Campbell to operate. Again, Campbell remained restrained. He continued building his own system. His notebooks expanded. He recorded names, addresses, routines, and connections. He tracked both criminals and officials. He used contacts, including individuals within law enforcement, to access information such as vehicle records and identities. While authorities tried to organize their efforts, he refined his own. Each incident increased his control while exposing the limits of the system. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred within the criminal world itself, among those who worked with or around him. This time, the provocation came from tension and fear. As his reputation grew, others became uneasy. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was a man who knew too much. His notebooks meant that he could identify anyone, locate anyone, and predict movements. Some individuals began to question him quietly. Others avoided him. A few considered distancing themselves entirely. Again, Campbell remained restrained. He did not confront them directly. He did not respond with open threats. He relied on presence. He appeared when needed, observed without speaking, and allowed his reputation to do the work. Each incident increased pressure within the underworld. Trust weakened. Fear replaced cooperation. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred on February 6, 1975, on a narrow road in. This time, the provocation was immediate. A patrol officer encountered Campbell's vehicle during a routine moment. It was unexpected. There was no preparation, no time for planning. For a brief moment, the situation remained controlled. Then it changed. Instead of stopping, Campbell accelerated. What could have been a simple interaction became a high-speed chase through a quiet suburb. The chase drew attention. More units joined. The situation moved from observation to direct confrontation. Again, his response was controlled, but no longer passive. This was not silence. This was movement. Each previous incident had led to this point. A pattern of restraint followed by a single decisive shift. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. Everything changed when law enforcement stopped the vehicle and conducted a full search. Inside the car, they found weapons, ICS, and cash. But what mattered most was not immediately visible as a threat. It was contained in written pages. Notebooks. Detailed, organized, and extensive. They contained the names, home addresses, and personal habits of hundreds of individuals. Police officers. Judges. Prosecutors. Politicians. Criminal figures. Witnesses. Some names belonged to people already dead. Others were still alive. This incident crossed a line. It showed that was not only acting within the system of crime. He was studying and documenting the entire structure around him. He had built a personal intelligence network that extended into both the underworld and law enforcement. This was no longer about individual crimes. It was about control through information. Authority response was immediate, but not unified. Multiple agencies moved in. Detroit police, federal investigators, and county authorities all sought control over the evidence. Instead of cooperation, there was conflict. Each group understood the value of what had been found. The notebooks did not just expose criminals. They exposed weaknesses, connections, and possible corruption within the system itself. The focus shifted. It was no longer only about prosecuting Campbell. It was about managing the information he had collected. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. He could no longer operate in silence. His system had been exposed. The balance that allowed him to move between worlds had been broken. The arrest did not simply stop a man. It ended a method. And once that method was revealed, there was no path back to what existed before. That evening, after his arrest on February 6, 1975, spoke quietly inside a holding cell. The events of the day had moved quickly. A routine drive had turned into a high-speed chase. A quiet suburb had become the center of attention. Officers had searched his car and found weapons, ICS, and something far more serious, his notebooks. Now, the movement had stopped. Inside the cell, there was no noise from engines, no flashing lights, no urgency. Only stillness. The kind of stillness that follows an event that cannot be undone. Campbell sat calmly. He did not appear shaken. He did not ask questions. He did not demand a lawyer. He had been through the system before. He understood the process. But this time was different. He was no longer dealing with a single charge or a single case. What had been discovered in his possession changed the situation entirely. The notebooks connected him to people, patterns, and information that reached across both the criminal world and law enforcement. Nearby, another inmate spoke to him. It was a normal interaction, quiet and brief. The kind of conversation that happens between two men sharing a confined space, both aware that something serious has taken place. Campbell responded without emotion. "I'm a dead man. Whether I stay in here or get out, I'm dead." He did not threaten anyone. He did not describe what he might do. He did not attempt to shift blame or explain his position. He simply stated what he believed would happen next. Those who heard him understood the meaning. It was not a statement of fear. It was a statement of recognition. Campbell had spent years building a system based on information. He tracked people. He recorded details. He understood how power moved between individuals and institutions. Now, that system had been exposed. Law enforcement had his notebooks. They had names, addresses, and patterns. They had evidence that pointed not only to criminal activity, but also to possible corruption and hidden connections. At the same time, those within the criminal world would understand what had happened. The man who kept records on everyone had been arrested. The man who knew too much had lost control of his information. For both sides, this created risk. Campbell understood that risk better than anyone. If he remained in prison, he could still speak. He could still reveal information. He could still affect outcomes. If he was released, he could return to a system that no longer trusted him. Either way, he was exposed. His statement was not about a single threat. It was about the loss of protection that had existed before. For years, he had operated in a space where neither side could fully act against him. Now, both sides had reason to. The quiet tone of his voice reflected acceptance, not panic. He had reached a point where outcomes were no longer controlled by planning or patience. They were already set in motion. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. Before everything changed, February 6, 1975 began as a normal day in. It was a quiet suburb. Large homes, wide lawns, calm streets. A place where people expected stability. A place where serious crime was rare. Residents followed their routines without concern. Cars moved at normal speed. People went about their day. Nothing suggested that a major event was about to take place. Campbell was also following a routine. He was driving toward his girlfriend's home. It was one of the places where he stored personal items, including weapons and documents. He had been living between two environments, one in Detroit, shaped by crime and control, and one in the suburbs, shaped by normal life. This dual existence allowed him to move between worlds. In Detroit, he operated as a known figure within the underworld. In Orchard Lake, he appeared as someone else entirely. That contrast had worked for him. Until that moment. As he drove along a narrow road, he came around a bend and encountered a patrol car. It was not planned. It was not part of any larger operation. It was a simple, routine encounter. For a brief second, everything remained normal. Two vehicles approaching each other on a quiet road. Then the moment passed. The patrol officer reacted, slowing down. Campbell made a decision. Instead of stopping, he accelerated. What followed was immediate. The patrol car turned. A pursuit began. The quiet streets of Orchard Lake changed in seconds. Additional units were called. Vehicles moved through the area at high speed. The calm environment was replaced by urgency and noise. Residents who expected nothing unusual saw something they would not forget. A chase moving through a place that had not seen such events before. The setting itself did not change. The houses remained. The roads remained. The environment stayed the same. But what happened within that setting broke its normal pattern. The contrast made the event stand out. A man who had spent years avoiding direct confrontation was now in one. A system that had struggled to contain him had been forced into action by chance. There was no long investigation leading to that moment. No carefully planned operation. Just a narrow road. A patrol car. And a decision made in seconds. Routine had continued as usual. Until it didn't. That contrast is what made the incident unforgettable. Because in a place where nothing was supposed to happen, everything changed at once. The final provocation came from authority itself. By the time was stopped and placed under arrest, law enforcement had already begun to escalate publicly. What had once been quiet investigations and controlled surveillance became direct action. Multiple agencies became involved at once. Detroit police, federal agents, and county authorities all moved in. The stop-in was no longer just about a traffic violation or a chase. It became a full exposure. Officers surrounded the scene. Weapons were drawn. Commands were clear and repeated. This time, there was no ambiguity. Campbell was no longer being watched from a distance. He was no longer a name in a file or a suspect in a report. He was physically present, contained, and under direct control of law enforcement. The search that followed was conducted openly. Officers removed items from the vehicle one by one. Firearms were secured. Narcotics were documented. Cash was counted. Then came the notebooks. The discovery changed the tone immediately. What had been an arrest became something larger. Officers recognized that they were not just dealing with a suspect, but with a man who had collected detailed information on hundreds of individuals across both the criminal world and the justice system. Word spread quickly. Supervisors were called. Additional personnel arrived. The situation expanded beyond a single arrest into a multi-agency event. This was public escalation. Not in the form of speeches or announcements, but in action. Law enforcement had stepped forward, fully and visibly, to take control. For years, Campbell had operated without direct confrontation. Now, that distance was gone. He stood. Not in defiance, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement. He complied with commands. He did not attempt to flee again. He did not argue or protest. The shift was clear. The space he had once controlled had been replaced by a space controlled by others. According to witnesses, everything happened in seconds. The initial moment, the near collision between Campbell's vehicle and the patrol car, was brief. There was no warning, no preparation. Just two vehicles approaching each other on a narrow road. The officer reacted immediately. Brakes were applied. The patrol car slowed. Campbell made a decision just as quickly. He accelerated. Movements were precise. The patrol car turned to pursue. Communication went out over the radio. Additional units responded. What began as a single encounter became an active chase within moments. The vehicles moved through the quiet streets at high speed. There was no hesitation in the actions taken. Each movement followed the last without delay. The pursuit was controlled, but urgent. Within a short time, officers closed the distance. They forced the vehicle to stop. Before intervention was possible from any other direction, the outcome was decided. Campbell was removed from the car. He did not resist physically. There was no prolonged struggle. The decisive moment had already passed when he chose to run and was then stopped. Officers secured him. The scene stabilized quickly. What followed, the search, the discovery of evidence, the involvement of multiple agencies, came after the critical moment had already ended. The decisive action was not prolonged. It was contained within seconds. A near collision. A decision to flee. A pursuit. A stop. In that short sequence, a man who had avoided capture for years was finally brought under control. The outcome did not depend on extended conflict. It depended on timing. And once that timing shifted, everything that followed became unavoidable. stopped immediately once his vehicle was blocked and surrounded by officers on that narrow road in. The movement ended without confusion. The chase, the speed, the urgency, all of it came to a sudden and complete stop. What followed was controlled, measured, and direct. Officers approached carefully. Weapons were drawn. Commands were clear and repeated. Every step was taken with caution. They were not dealing with an ordinary suspect. They were dealing with a man connected to multiple violent crimes, a man known for precision and planning. Campbell did not resist. He remained still inside the vehicle until ordered to move. When instructed, he exited slowly. His hands were visible. His posture was calm. There was no attempt to run. No sudden movement. No argument. He allowed officers to search him. He allowed himself to be restrained. The process moved forward without interruption. To those watching, it was notable. This was a man who had avoided capture for years. A man who had operated between systems, controlling information, influencing outcomes, and maintaining distance from direct confrontation. Yet in this moment, he did not fight. He did not challenge authority. He complied completely. It was not submission in the emotional sense. It was recognition. Recognition that the situation had shifted beyond recovery. That the variables he once controlled were no longer in his hands. That the structure he had built, based on information, timing, and silence, had been exposed. Officers then moved to search the vehicle. They removed weapons. 2 semi-automatic pistols. A rifle. A sawed-off shotgun. Narcotics. Cash. Then they found the notebooks. Page after page of names, addresses, routines, and connections. The discovery changed everything. Supervisors were called. Additional officers arrived. The scene expanded from a simple arrest into something far more serious. Campbell watched. Still calm. Still silent. He did not react to the discovery. He did not attempt to explain what the notebooks contained. He did not deny their existence. He stood as the process continued around him. Before being removed from the scene, he said nothing of significance to the officers. But later, inside a holding area, away from the noise and movement, he spoke quietly to another inmate. There was no audience. No performance. Just a statement. I'm a dead man. Whether I stay in here or get out, I'm dead. It was delivered without emotion. No anger. No fear. No hesitation. Those who heard him understood. This was not a threat. It was not a warning directed outward. It was an internal conclusion. Campbell understood the position he was now in. For years, he had existed between 2 systems, the criminal world and law enforcement. He had gathered information on both. He had used that information to maintain control and avoid consequence. Now, that balance was gone. Law enforcement had his records. The criminal world knew he had been captured. Both sides now had reason to see him differently. And in that moment, he accepted what that meant. The opposing forces remained. Law enforcement continued its operations. Criminal networks continued their activities. The city of did not stop. But the structure within those systems changed. Authorities now held the notebooks. They contained detailed information, names of officers, judges, prosecutors, criminals, and witnesses. Addresses, habits, routines. Information that should not have been accessible to a single individual. Multiple agencies moved to control that evidence. Detroit police, federal investigators, and county authorities all became involved. Instead of immediate cooperation, there was conflict. Each agency understood the value of what had been found. The notebooks did not only point to crimes. They pointed to weaknesses. They suggested corruption. They revealed how information had moved between systems. Law enforcement procedures began to shift. Internal reviews were conducted. Access to information became more restricted. Greater attention was placed on how data was stored, shared, and protected. The idea that one man had built a personal intelligence network powerful enough to challenge institutional control forced a change in behavior. At the same time, the criminal world responded. Campbell had been a central figure. Not because he led a large organization, but because he enforced structure through fear and knowledge. His absence created a gap. The group known as Murder Row, once a dominant force in Michigan's drug trade, began to weaken. Without Campbell, control was no longer maintained through quiet authority. It shifted into open conflict. Leaders within the group competed for power. Alliances broke down. Violence increased, but it was no longer controlled. It was internal. Within a few years, the organization collapsed. Members were killed. Others were arrested. The system that had once relied on discipline and precision dissolved into instability. The Italian Mafia figures who had supported and used Campbell moved on. They replaced structures. They found new individuals. But they did not find another like him. Across the environment, behavior changed. Witnesses became more cautious. The memory of what had happened to those who spoke remained clear. Criminals became more aware of exposure. The idea that information could be collected, stored, and used against them changed how they operated. Law enforcement became more careful. The failure to contain one individual had shown the limits of the system. The message required no repetition. It was understood by all sides. Control is not always held by force. Sometimes, it is held by information. And when that information is exposed, the balance of power shifts immediately. Chester Wheeler Campbell did not need to act in that final moment. His system had already acted for him. And once it was revealed, nothing in that environment could remain the same. When the events were reviewed by authorities, a clear pattern began to emerge. Investigators from multiple agencies, Detroit police, federal units, and county prosecutors, looked back over the timeline connected to. What they found was not random activity. It was a consistent method. The pattern began with escalation. Over the years, Campbell had moved from small crimes to controlled, high-level operations. His early conviction in 1955 showed direct violence. But after his release in 1969, his approach changed. The crimes became harder to prove. The connections became indirect. The outcomes became more precise. He was suspected in multiple murders. Yet those cases did not result in convictions. Each time investigators believed they were close, something happened. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence weakened. Cases collapsed. This was not a single failure. It was repeated. Warnings had been present throughout. Law enforcement had seen his name appear again and again. Detectives had tracked his movements. Informants had mentioned his role. His reputation in the criminal world had been clear. He was not hidden. He was known. But knowing was not enough. The system required proof. And proof was consistently removed before it could be used. One of the strongest warnings came from the death of a protected witness. Placed inside a federal facility, the witness was expected to be safe. Instead, he was killed. The location, the method, and the message sent through that act showed that the system's protections could be reached. That event should have changed everything. But even then, no direct conviction followed. The pattern continued. System failure became part of the structure. There were weaknesses in coordination. Agencies worked separately or competed for control. Information was not always shared effectively. There were weaknesses in protection. Witnesses could not be guaranteed safety. There were weaknesses in internal control. Access to sensitive data had been compromised, allowing Campbell to gather information from within law enforcement systems. Each weakness alone might have been manageable. Together, they created conditions where one individual could operate without being stopped. The discovery of the notebooks confirmed what had only been suspected. Campbell had not been reacting to events. He had been studying them, tracking people, recording patterns, building a system of knowledge that allowed him to stay ahead of both criminals and investigators. When authorities reviewed the contents, they saw connections that had not been visible before. Names linked to cases. Addresses linked to movements. Habits linked to outcomes. The notebooks explained how he had avoided detection for so long. They also showed how much of the system had been exposed. The investigation shifted. It was no longer only about individual crimes. It was about understanding how the system had allowed those crimes to continue. Officials recognized that Campbell's success was not based only on personal skill. It was also based on structural weakness. The conclusion was unavoidable. This was not a case of one man acting alone in isolation. It was a case of one man operating effectively within a system that could not fully control him. Escalation had been visible. Warnings had been clear. Failures had been repeated. By the time of his arrest, the outcome was already shaped by everything that had come before. The final event did not create the case. It revealed it. Long after the incident, the story continued to circulate across and beyond. It was not told loudly. It was not repeated in full detail. Instead, it moved quietly, passed between investigators, officers, and those who had lived through that time. Parts of it appeared in reports. Parts of it remained in memory. Some details were spoken carefully. Others were left unsaid. It stayed alive not because of spectacle. There were no dramatic endings. No public confessions. No final confrontation that resolved everything clearly. What remained was something else. Meaning. The case showed how one individual could move through both the criminal world and the system meant to stop it. It showed how information, when gathered with patience and discipline, could become more powerful than force. People remembered the notebooks. Not just what they contained, but what they represented. Names. Addresses. Habits. Patterns. A complete picture of a city's hidden structure, written down by one man. Law enforcement remembered the failures. The missed opportunities. The moments where action could have changed the outcome. They adjusted their methods. They became more cautious with information. They understood that control could be lost not through violence, but through exposure. The criminal world remembered something different. They remembered what happened when one person held too much knowledge. They saw how quickly power could disappear once that knowledge was taken away. They saw how systems built on fear and control could collapse without the figure who maintained them. In places like this, control does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one who understands the system best. And once that understanding is revealed, nothing remains hidden for long. Information, once exposed, cannot be contained again.